Hi biology students, this is Mrs. Miller again, and we're going to be continuing on chemistry of life. This time we're going to be on section 3, which is going to cover properties of water. One of my favorite questions to ask my bio students is, what is the most important molecule for life? A lot of people are going to sit here and argue that it's DNA, maybe it's proteins, but in fact, it's water that's the most important substance for life. Water has some unique sets of properties that allows us to interact with many other molecules that are also necessary for life. Most organisms are mainly made up of water. Some are very, very high percentages. Humans are about 60% or up to 60% of the human adult body is water. So if we didn't have this water, we would die very quickly, which is why it's so very important, along with several other things that water allows us to do within our bodies. The first thing we want you guys to understand is, what is the structure of water? So each molecule of water, remember, a molecule is something that is made up of 2 or more atoms. And when we look at water, it's going to be 1 atom of oxygen, here in red, and then it also has 2 atoms of hydrogen, which here are white. So the chemical formula for water is going to be H2O. The oxygen in this case is stronger, so the electrons spend more time near it. So in this case, it's drawn that the oxygen is bigger, and we can see that it's clearly hanging on to the other 2. This results in a negative charge near the oxygen atom and a positive charge near the hydrogen atom. So again, that's because if we think about this as a tug of war, the oxygen is better at tug of war than the hydrogens. So those electrons go closer to it, and that gets this partial negative charge, whereas the hydrogens get this partial positive charge. It's this unequal sharing of electrons between the elements that's called polarity. The definition for a polar molecule is a molecule in which part of the molecule is positively charged and part of the molecule is negatively charged. So in this case, when I look at my water, my 2 hydrogens have this partial positive charge on them, whereas my oxygen has this partial negative charge on it. In essence, the electrons are pulled toward the nucleus of the oxygen atom and away from the hydrogen atom nucleus. So when I look at this, it's like the electrons are being pulled closer to my oxygen, and because electrons are negative, that's why we get this overall negative charge on that oxygen. When we talk about these polar covalent molecules, or these polar molecules in general, what we're seeing is we're getting some opposite charges. And what happens is these opposite charges are attracted to one another. The positive hydrogens become attracted to the negative oxygen. So what we see is, because of this attraction, bonds form between these hydrogen and these oxygen atoms of other molecules. Here we can see those, which ends up being this hydrogen bond, and they're shown as dashed lines. This type of bond always involves a hydrogen atom, so that's why it got its nickname as the hydrogen bond. When we think about the other types of bonds that we've introduced you to, those covalent bonds, the ionic bonds, hydrogen bonds are a little bit different. Hydrogen bonds are just attractions. So these attractions are not the same as sharing or transferring electrons. So they're not nearly as strong as bonds within molecules. Nevertheless, they help hold water molecules together. So we can see these little bonds, these hydrogen bonds, as little dashed lines. We don't show them as solid lines because they're simply not as strong. Because hydrogen bonds like this, with these opposite charges being attracted, water gets some unique properties. And there's 6 that we're going to talk about today, and that would be the high boiling point of water, its high specific heat, adhesion and cohesion, surface tension, and capillary action. So let's dig into those. The first one we're going to talk about is that water has a very high boiling point, which is 100 degrees Celsius, and we consider it to be high compared to other substances on Earth like methane, oxygen, and hydrogen. Water doesn't have the highest boiling point out of everything, but it's pretty high overall. When we consider other liquids, a lot of other liquids are going to be boiling much before 100 degrees Celsius. And again, this is a result of the hydrogen bonding. What we see is those particles want to stay together because the positive hydrogens are attracted to those negative oxygens. The boiling point describes the temperature that a substance begins to go through the liquid to a gas change of state. All forms of water as we know it need liquid water. So we need water to be below this 100 degrees Celsius for us to be able to use it. Another interesting fact about water is that water has a very high specific heat. Specific heat is the amount of energy needed to raise or lower the temperature of a substance. As a result, water plays a very important role in temperature regulation, and since cells are made up of mostly water, this property helps them to maintain what we call a stable environment in cells, which we're going to talk about is homeostasis. We'll refer to that more later. But the specific heat is important because water takes a lot of energy to change its temperature, whether that's to cool down or to heat up. The more water that we have in us, it's going to help us to regulate our temperature really well. What we see with people who get dehydrated is their temperature can't be controlled very easily, so their temperature changes a lot. If we give these people water, then what we would see is they'd have an easier time regulating their temperature. And not all things are going to have the same specific heat. Something like a metal has a very low specific heat in comparison to water's high specific heat, so metals heat up and cool down very quickly, whereas water doesn't do that. The next property that we're going to look at is adhesion. So adhesion is another important physical property of water. And what adhesion is, it's the ability of water to stick to a different substance. So here I have this leaf and water is adhering to the leaf. Okay, it's sticking to it. We can think about Band-Aids. Band-Aids adhere to our skin where we have two different substances sticking together, the Band-Aid and the skin. We can see that water likes to cling to leaves or to spider webs and things like that after the rain or in the morning. But the adhesion is one substance and it's going to be attaching itself to the water, or the water attaches itself to a different substance. Okay? Cohesion is a little bit different. It's still a property that's caused by hydrogen bonding, but cohesion is the ability of water to stick to itself. So water sticking to water. This is why water bubbles form on a penny or why raindrops form. So here we have a really good example. Water wants to stick to itself. It doesn't want to let go, so we get these little domes on pennies. This is also why on this particular leaf, we see big water droplets. The water is trying to hold on to each other. The water sticking to the leaf is adhesion, but the water sticking to itself to create these big droplets, that's cohesion. Water sticking to itself. Surface tension is a very interesting property of water. Surface tension is a phenomenon in which the surface of a liquid, where the liquid is in contact with a gas, acts like a thin elastic sheet. That gas we're thinking about is just going to be air in our atmosphere, so nitrogen, oxygen, and all those other things that make up our air, coming in contact with the surface of water. What happens is the water molecules on the surface form stronger bonds. Here we can see we have more arrows going back and forth than when we get lower. This allows water striders to walk on the surface, so we can see up here a water strider. Because of those extra bonds near the surface, it's acting like a sheet and that water strider can walk on it. And it also explains why the belly flop hurts. So your body is trying to break more of those bonds at the surface, which is why it really feels bad on your stomach when you do a belly flop, either on purpose or on accident. The last one that we're going to talk about is capillary action. So capillary action is the ability of a liquid to flow against gravity, or up on Earth, in a narrow space. So an example of capillary action is when you place a straw into a glass of water. If you were to look at where the water level is in the glass versus where the water level is in the straw, inside the straw, your water level should be higher. But why does this happen? Well, the water is creating hydrogen bonds with the surface of the straw, so that's adhesion, water sticking to something else, causing the water to adhere to the sides and to climb. As the diameter of the straw gets smaller, water can move higher up the straw. So here we have several different straws in a green liquid. We can see overall down here with the really large diameter, the liquid is able to climb up a little bit. But when we look at this really thin one, the water is able to climb quite high. So again, it's just that water adhering or sticking to something else inside of the straw. The last thing that we want to review with you guys are solutions. Many solutions in the world are made up of water. In fact, most of the ones that we can probably think about are made up of water. And inside of a solution, this is when a liquid has something dissolved in it. So we can break that solution into two phases, which is the solute or two parts, the solute and the solvent. The solute is the object being dissolved, whereas the solvent is the liquid doing dissolving. So for example, we could use salt water, that's our overall solution. Salt is the solute or the thing that's being dissolved. Water is the thing that's doing the dissolving, so it's the solvent. Water is considered to be the universal solvent because it can dissolve most things because of its polarity. So it's pretty cool that you can put most things into water and we're going to see that they mix together and they'll form their own solution. There are some things like oil that isn't going to form a nice solution, and that's because oil is not polar, whereas water is polar. If you guys have any questions, let us know. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.